It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Robert Lawrence Stine, best known as R.L. Stine, is an incredibly popular author of children's books. He got his start writing humor books for kids with the pen name Jovial Bob Stine in the 70s. His magazine Bananas, which was a humor mag for teens, ran for nearly a decade between 1975 and 1984. He even wrote the 1987 adaptation Spaceballs, the book. But by the end of the 80s, he moved to the horror genre almost exclusively, which would make him a superstar in young readers and kids' literature. This began in 1989 with two series that he geared toward teens who were interested in more of the horror that was popular in the decade. The Babysitter ran for 4 books between 1989 and 1995. Surprisingly, that series has never been adapted into a TV series or film series, at least at the time of recording this episode. But that very same year, he began the Fear Street series. Now, Fear Street was first adapted into a TV series in the late 90s, but it performed poorly. So then, in the 2020s, Netflix released the first of a series of Fear Street films that actually did become quite popular. But it was the start of 1992's book series that really launched Stine into the stratosphere. Between 1992 and 1997, Stine wrote 62 novellas that would make up the Goosebumps franchise. These were, no pun intended, monstrously popular among children between the ages of maybe 8 or 9 to about 12 or 13. Since I was 15 when the series started, I was not aware of its popularity until I was in my early 20s, and that's when home video releases of episodes of the 1995 TV series would hit the video store shelf where I worked. And when I was a little younger, I remember when this era of kids horror really kind of got started. I mean, there were shows like Amazing Stories that sometimes had a monster element to episodes. There were series like Eerie, Indiana, which was also on TV in the early parts of my high school days. Nickelodeon had Are You Afraid of the Dark that ran for a whopping 10 seasons starting in 1991. So I kind of feel like all these shows helped keep horror and monsters relevant for the millennial generation that was starting to become the right age to get into this type of stuff. So for this week's Monster Mondays, I'm going to discuss the 2015 adaptation of both R.L. Stine and his greatest creation, Goosebumps. This is an interesting type of adaptation because it basically features all of his greatest and most memorable creatures across several of his books. And it's not just a single book adaptation. After all, there were 62 books. Which ones do you do? Which ones do you start with? Which one is the most popular of all those books? And on top of that, R.L. Stine is a character in this movie, and he's played by Jack Black. So it makes his books part of the universe in which the movie taking the name of the book series exists in. So it's a meta adaptation of his most popular work. It also presents Stine as a bit of a disturbed character as well. However, how they use the inclusion of the author as a character is also interesting, and I'll be talking about that later when I get into my likes. Now, I do think of Stine as something of the Stephen King for kiddos, right? I mean, if kids start to kind of get into the horror genre, Stine is there for them to read, and then they kind of graduate from him and his Goosebumps books into like PG-13 horror movies, and then they can move into the R-rated and Stephen King space. But the thing about Stine is that, he has fun monster ideas too. I mean, and there's some that he very clearly adapts as well. I mean, it's safe, but still gives you, goosebumps. His influences come from reading old horror comics as a kid, like Tales from the Crypt. And in fact, in 2017, Stine did a brief run with Marvel Comics for a 5-issue Man-Thing series. There's even a creature in this movie that looks an awful lot like Man-Thing in the big climax of the movie when they get to the school and all of the monsters have been let out and they're attacking. I read that Man-Thing series, and it was what Stine does really well. He has a monster and he has a little bit of fun and sense of humor with it too. But let's get into the movie itself. At the start, we meet Zach and his mother, Gail, and they're moving to Madison, Delaware. About a year before, Zach's father passed away, and Gail has taken on a new vice principal gig at the high school. They're moving from New York City. That's only briefly kind of talked about, how they're kind of coming from the big city to the suburbs. Now, Zach meets the girl next door, Hannah. Now, while she seems warm and wants to get to know Zach, her father is peculiar, and he's very strict and unneighborly towards Zach. Basically, he tells Zach in no uncertain terms to stay away from him and his daughter. Now, despite her father's strict rules and attempts to scare Zach off, the homeschooled Hannah continues to attempt to get to know the guy who lives next door. And she even tells Zach to follow her to a place that she likes to hang out, a small abandoned amusement park that never got finished being built. Now, upon returning home, Zach is warned one more time by Hannah's father to stay away from them. And while he's doing his homework, he hears Hannah and her father get into a shouting match, which ends with her screaming. So he tries to figure out what happened, but her father tells him to get away, or the last scream he will hear will be his own. However, when Zach calls the cops, there is no Hannah in the house, and the scream came from what the father says is a surround sound system playing a horror movie on the TV. At the first day of school, Zach met the likably dorky Champ, whose real name is Champ. It's short for champion. I mean, duh, right? But the two guys trick Hannah's father to get him to leave his house while they try to get into the house to check on Hannah. And so they break into the basement, where they find all sorts of strange and creepy things like cuckoo clocks and bear traps and all of that. When they get into the house, they hear something moving around upstairs, and they discover the noise is actually coming from a bookcase full of original Goosebumps manuscripts. All of them are also locked. Now, Zach uses a key to unlock one of the books, and Hannah appears and asks if they did what she thinks they just did, which was unlock one of the books. And when Zach picks the book up again, it opens, and out of the book comes that story's monster, the abominable snowman of Pasadena. Hannah runs to the ice rink and tells Zach that he's in way over his head on this, and she doesn't have time to explain what's going on. And they find her on the ice with the book, where she is going to try to suck the monster back into the manuscript. At first she fails, which leads to the three kids getting chased by the creature, but her father arrives to put the monster back into the book. And it's then that Zach realizes that Hannah's father is none other than R.L. Stine. Now, back at Stine's house, he tells Zach that when he was growing up, he had these terrible allergies, which forced him to stay inside all the time. The neighborhood kids and the people around the town kind of picked on him, and he didn't really have any friends, so he created his own friends through his writing. And in time, those friends became real, and he used them to kind of terrorize the locals that picked on him. However, he soon discovered the worst of the creatures had gotten out of his book, Slappy, from The Night of the Living Dummy. Now, Slappy takes all of the books and absconds while letting a few monsters out. Soon, Stine, Zach, Hannah, and Champ are attacked by a bunch of killer gnomes from one of the books. And when they get outside, they discover that Slappy is not only releasing the monsters into the world, but he's burning some of the books to keep them from being able to be put back into their respective stories. Damage is done quite quickly once Slappy opens a bunch of the books, and Zach suggests that Stine write a new manuscript that can be used to basically recapture all of these creatures. But he'd have to basically write one story with all of the monsters he ever created in that one story to make sure he gets them all. And Stine has to write on a very specific typewriter, which is part of the magic of the creatures coming to life. However, they have to avoid the werewolf of Fever Swamp in a grocery store first, and they're able to get away from that thanks to Zach's kooky Aunt Lorraine hitting it with her car, only to have to basically then cross the cemetery to get to the high school where Stine's typewriter is being kept. And when moonlight hits Hannah, Zach soon learns that she too is another of Stine's creations, the ghost next door. But they have to get out of the cemetery as quickly as possible because a bunch of ghouls and zombies have been brought to life thanks to Slappy opening that book. Now, Zach confronts Stine about Hannah's situation, and Zach thinks it's kind of cruel that he wrote a daughter that doesn't know that she isn't real. But Stine explains that he's lived a very lonely life, and that changed when he created Hannah, and he did create her to actually believe that she's real. It's given him some sort of a semblance of a heart, essentially. But Stine ends up getting his typewriter and a blank book for him to put his manuscript in to begin writing the story to solve all of this before Slappy comes for him. And the monsters arrive at the school where the semi-formal dance is happening, and Slappy has the army of garden gnomes open the rest of the books and burns them all, which basically means that all of Stine's creations are now out in the open. And while he's doing that, Zach mobilizes the students at the dance to help barricade the doors to buy Stine as much time as possible to write this book. But Slappy gets into the school and gets to Stine regardless and smashes the writer's hands. So they have to come up with a different plan to defeat the monsters. So Stine and Zach decide to rig a school bus to explode when attacked by the creatures, while they escaped in a different bus. And even though the creatures reform after being exploded, it does give our heroes a chance to retreat to the abandoned amusement park, where Zach takes over typing while Stine dictates his grand final story to Zach. But Stine has to trust Zach to finish the book on his own while he faces down the very last creature that Slappy releases at the amusement park, the blob that ate everyone. Just as Zach finishes the book, the monsters attack the Ferris wheel that Zach, Hannah, and Champ are sitting in. And when it stops after rolling away down the hill, Hannah convinces Zach, to open the book, even if that means that she will also be sucked into it with the rest of Stine's creations. Knowing she has been a creation all this time, she's okay with this. She has to, she tells Zach that he basically has to let her go. And it does work to rid the town of all the monsters, and it also takes Hannah with them. But things start to return to normal, and Stine himself actually takes a job as the interim English teacher, it is kind of funny because at one point, Jack Black as R.L. Stine is walking in the hallways of the school. He passes the real R.L. Stine, whom he refers to as Mr. Black, the new drama teacher. I get it. It's a little bit of a crisscross of the guy playing the other guy and what they each do in their real lives. But anyway, Stine reveals to Zach that he wrote one more book to bring Hannah back. And after releasing the real non-ghost Hannah into the world, Stine burns the book that created her, and all is good in the world. Oh, except for the invisible boy being forgotten about and starting to type his own revenge story on Stine's typewriter in the school's trophy case. All right, so let's talk about 3 things I like about 2015's Goosebumps. First, as I previously mentioned, I like how this got adapted for a big screen movie by not having to decide one specific book to be adapted first and doing this meta adaptation, which opens the door for a bunch of books creatures to get a chance to be seen. We've got an abominable snowman, we've got gnomes, we've got a creepy killer dummy, we've got aliens with freeze guns that go around and freezes everybody in town. We've got a floating demon dog, we've got the invisible boy, there's a giant praying mantis, we've got a werewolf, there's a graveyard full of zombies, a ghost girl. It's pretty big bang for your buck when it comes to monsters. I mean, each creature also has a little bit of their own little vignette too as part of the story. I mean, there are some that get an overarching story like Slappy and like Hannah. But like a lot of the other creatures are part of the adventure element of getting to the, like getting to the school or having to deal with something in this particular set piece or whatever the case is. And I have to imagine in all the episodes of Monster Mondays I've ever done, this movie has to have the most variety of monsters of all of the movies I've covered. And it has to be the one that's got the most sheer number of monsters. So good job, Goosebumps. You broke a record, I'm sure, for this show. Second, while this movie is fairly boilerplate in terms of plot and concept, and a lot of the beats of this movie are things you generally see in a lot of action adventure movies for kids, I think this would be a great movie to show a young kid if they have some interest in monsters. It's mostly innocent and inoffensive. The obvious love interests of Zach and Hannah are generally sweet and chaste while being, well, obvious, right? There's obvious they like each other, but there's no real attempt to do much more other than they just like to be around each other, and it's a very sweet relationship. There's also no blood, but there are moments of gooey grossness that would particularly appeal to little boys. But I think the Hannah character would appeal to little girls too. So if you've got a little kid or a nephew or a niece or a little brother or sister or something that might be interested in spooks and monsters, this would be a pretty good introduction to the concept of horror. And it might really be a good watch for, like Halloween season or whatever. But as I mentioned earlier, the books are a great gateway to horror. So this movie should also serve a similar purpose. Third, this is something I've always liked about this movie in both instances in which I watched it, but I don't think it gets quite enough attention in the movie itself, but I'm going to count it anyway. I really like how we get to the monsters being something that can come to life. What I mean about that is that the origin point for the quote unquote magic that brings the creatures out of their books into the real world is actually quite negative. Stine talked about how he was stuck inside due to being terribly allergic to everything. So he had no friends or much of any kind of human contact. It made him, it affected him in a way that made him kind of a bad guy. When he did have interaction with people, it led to him being picked on a little bit. So he created these characters and creatures as his friends, which then led them to becoming menaces to the town that he lived in. I mean, he created these characters. Essentially, he's playing God in one way, and he creates these characters in the way that allows for him to basically create them in very simplistic terms. They're all monsters. They're all bad. There's not a one of them that is particularly good or redeeming. So what do? They go out and terrorize. So that's obviously going to be getting revenge on the people who picked on him. So it's heavily alluded to that he started changing the way he viewed the world once he created Hannah. Thus, it locked away the menaces in his manuscripts, but he's still prickly around her in particular. So not only is Stine kind of the origin point of the evil monsters, thus making him, in very basic terms, a sort of a villain too, but his antithesis, Slappy, also represents something that even Zach calls Stine out for. He creates things that he either doesn't tell them the truth about their existence, or he creates things that he doesn't allow to truly live. It's kind of a two sides of the same coin concept. Slappy and Hannah are opposites, and both have either been kept in the dark about something or feels like they've been barred some semblance of life. That creates a sort of complexity around the Stine character that you can really kind of sink your teeth into or debate on a fairly serious level, especially if you're an adult watching this movie. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieeinema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, I wrap up the month of 2010's Monster Flicks with an animated feature from Marvel as the Incredible Hulk learns where monsters dwell. Until next week, stay spooky.